The summer I turned 8 was the summer everything changed. Not just because of what happened at Pine Ridge Campground in upstate New York, but because it was the first time I truly understood that adults could lie, that monsters were real, and that sometimes the people meant to protect you are the ones you should fear most. Dad had been out of work for 3 months. The plant where he'd worked for 12 years had shut down, moving operations to Mexico, leaving half our town unemployed. Mom picked up extra shifts at the diner, but even with her working double 6 days a week, we couldn't make the mortgage payments. I remember the way Dad's hands would shake when he opened bills, the way Mom would count and recount the crumpled dollar bills in her purse, and the way they'd stop talking whenever I walked into the room. That's why when Dad's old Army buddy Pete offered us his cabin at Pine Ridge for 2 weeks in July, completely free, Mom cried with relief. "A real vacation," she kept saying, "just like normal families have." Dad forced a smile and said it would be good for all of us to get away from everything for a while. My little sister Emma was 6, blonde and trusting in that way that makes you want to protect her from everything bad in the world. She bounced in her car seat the whole 4-hour drive, chattering about swimming and s'mores and catching fireflies. I was excited too, but I'd started noticing things that year. The way Dad's jaw clenched when he looked at bills, the way Mom's eyes were always red-rimmed, the way our neighbors avoided making eye contact when they saw us at the grocery store. Pine Ridge Campground sat nestled between towering pines and a pristine lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. Pete's cabin was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a screened porch that overlooked the water. It should have been perfect. The campground had about 30 sites scattered throughout the woods, maybe half occupied during our stay. Families with RVs, couples in tents, a few groups of college kids. During the day it felt normal. Kids splashing in the lake, the smell of charcoal grills, adults sitting in lawn chairs with beer cans sweating in the heat. But something felt wrong from the first night. The campground keeper was a man named Earl Hutchins. He was probably in his 60s, tall and lean, with calloused hands and pale gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything. He wore the same olive green work shirt and faded jeans every day, always with that ring of keys jangling from his belt. Earl had run Pine Ridge for 15 years, Pete told us, knew every inch of the property. "Real outdoorsman type," Pete said with approval. "Kids love him. Always got stories about the woods, teaches them about tracking, wilderness survival, all that good stuff." Earl did seem to know a lot about everything. He could identify every bird call, point out animal tracks in the mud, tell you which berries were safe to eat. The first few days he was helpful and friendly, offering to take Emma and me on nature walks to show us the best fishing spots and teach us about the local wildlife. Mom and Dad were grateful for the attention. Money stress had made them irritable and distracted, and having someone else entertain us for a few hours each day gave them time to relax by the lake, actually talk to each other without snapping. I remember thinking Earl was like the grandfather we'd never had, patient, knowledgeable, interested in what we had to say. That changed on the 4th day. Emma had made friends with a girl named Sarah from the campsite next to ours. Sarah was 8 like me, but small for her age, with dark hair and serious brown eyes. Her parents, the Hendersons, were quiet people who kept to themselves, but they seemed nice enough. Sarah's dad was a mechanic from Buffalo, her mom a school secretary. They'd saved all year for this vacation. Sarah had been coming to Pine Ridge with her family for 3 years, and she knew things about Earl that the adults didn't see or chose not to see. "He's got cameras," she whispered to me while we sat on the dock, our feet dangling in the cool water. Emma was napping in the cabin, and our parents were playing cards on the Hendersons' picnic table. "Cameras? Where?" "Hidden in the trees near the bathhouses, near some of the campsites too. I saw him checking them one morning when I got up early to use the bathroom." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Are you sure?" Sarah nodded, her face grave beyond her years. "And there's other stuff. Kids have gone missing here before." "What do you mean, missing?" "Not from here exactly, but from campgrounds around the area. My dad doesn't know I heard him talking to my mom about it. 3 kids in the past 2 years, all from state parks and campgrounds within 50 miles of here. They just disappeared. During family camping trips, like they walked into the woods and never came back. I wanted to dismiss it as the kind of ghost stories kids tell each other, but something in Sarah's voice made me believe her. She wasn't trying to scare me for fun. She was trying to warn me. "There's more," she continued, glancing around to make sure no adults were listening. "Earl has this shed behind his trailer where he keeps the maintenance equipment. Sometimes at night, you can see lights on in there real late. And I've seen him talking to men who don't belong to any of the campsites. They come in trucks with no license plates." That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves, the crack of branches, the distant call of an owl. Around midnight I heard footsteps on the gravel path outside our cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps that paused right outside our screen door. I crept to the window and peered through the curtains. Earl stood in our little yard, completely still, looking at our cabin. He wasn't doing anything threatening exactly, just standing there in the moonlight with that ring of keys in his hand. But there was something predatory in his posture, something that made every instinct scream danger. After what felt like hours, he walked away, his footsteps fading into the woods. The next morning I told Mom what I'd seen. She frowned and said she'd mention it to Dad, but Earl probably just been checking on the cabins, making sure everything was secure, doing his job. When I brought up what Sarah had told me about the cameras and missing kids, Mom got that look adults get when they think you're being dramatic. "Sarah's probably just heard some grown-up conversations she didn't fully understand," Mom said, ruffling my hair. "You know how stories get exaggerated. Earl's been nothing but kind to us." But Dad took me aside later that day while Mom and Emma were at the lake. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice low and serious. "I want you to stay close to the cabin from now on. Don't go on any more nature walks with Earl, okay? And keep Emma with you at all times." "Do you believe me about—" "I believe something's not right here," Dad interrupted. "I made some calls this morning. There really have been kids who've gone missing from campgrounds in this area. Not many, and spread out over time, but enough to make me nervous." My stomach dropped. "So what do we do?" "We're going to pack up tomorrow morning and head home. I'll tell Mom we got a call about a job interview or something, but tonight, I want you to sleep in our room with Emma. And if Earl comes around again, you wake me up immediately." That evening felt different. The other campers seemed on edge too, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The Henderson family packed up after dinner and left without saying goodbye. A couple with a young son who'd been camped near the lake loaded their RV and drove away as the sun was setting. By the time darkness fell, Pine Ridge felt half empty. Earl made his rounds as usual, checking on the remaining campers, but he lingered longer at each site, asked more questions. When he stopped by our cabin, Dad was polite but distant. Earl's pale eyes kept shifting to Emma, who was playing with her dolls on the porch. "Shame about the Hendersons leaving so sudden-like," Earl said, jingling his keys. "Hope they weren't dissatisfied with their stay." "Just cut their trip short," Dad replied evenly. "Family emergency." Earl nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he didn't believe it. "Well, you folks planning to stay the full 2 weeks?" "We'll see how it goes," Dad said, which wasn't really an answer. After Earl left, Dad made sure all the windows were locked and checked the door twice. Mom sensed the tension but didn't ask questions. Emma fell asleep curled between Mom and Dad in their bed while I lay awake on the floor beside them, listening to every sound outside. Around 3 a.m, I heard them again, those slow, deliberate footsteps on gravel. But this time, there were more of them. Multiple sets of feet moving through the campground. I nudged Dad awake and pointed toward the window. Dad crept to the edge of the curtain and peered out. Then his whole body went rigid. He turned to Mom and shook her gently awake, putting a finger to his lips when she started to speak. Through the thin walls of the cabin, we could hear voices. Earl's voice, and at least 2 others. They were moving between the remaining campsites, and every few minutes we'd hear car doors slam, engines start, vehicles driving away. The few families left were leaving in the middle of the night. Dad grabbed our car keys and his wallet. "Get dressed," he whispered to Mom. "We're leaving. Now." "What's happening?" Mom asked, but she was already reaching for her clothes. "Just get Emma, and let's go." We dressed in the dark, moving as quietly as possible. Dad stuffed our essential belongings into a single bag while Mom woke Emma and explained they were playing a quiet game. Emma, still half asleep, went along with it. Dad cracked the door and peered out. The voices had moved further away toward the other side of the campground. "Okay, we go straight to the car, no talking, no noise. If something happens, you run to the car and drive away. Don't wait for me." The walk to our car felt like it took forever. Every step on the gravel path sounded like a gunshot to my ears. Emma walked between Mom and me while Dad carried our bag and constantly scanned the woods around us. We were maybe 20 feet from the car when the flashlight beam hit us. "Well, now, where you folks headed at this hour?" Earl's voice came from behind us, but I didn't dare turn around. Dad stopped walking, but didn't turn around either. "Family emergency back home. Got a call about my mother." "That's a shame," Earl said, and I could hear him walking closer. "Awful time to be driving, though. Dark roads, tired driver, dangerous." "We'll be fine," Dad said. "I'm sure you will be." Earl's voice was right behind us now, but I'd hate for anything to happen to such a nice family. The way he said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't an expression of concern, it was a threat. Dad handed Mom the car keys without turning around. "Get in the car," he said quietly. Mom unlocked the doors and we scrambled inside. Through the rear window I could see Earl standing in the gravel with his flashlight, but he wasn't alone anymore. 2 other men had emerged from the woods, big men wearing dark clothing. Dad got in and started the engine. Earl walked to his window and tapped on the glass with his flashlight. Dad rolled it down an inch. "You sure you won't reconsider?" Earl asked. "Lot of nice family time left in your stay." "We're sure," Dad said. Earl stepped back and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Well then, you folks drive safe now. And remember, Pine Ridge will always be here if you want to come back." Dad put the car in reverse, and we pulled out of our campsite. As we drove toward the campground exit, I looked back and saw Earl and the 2 men watching us leave. Earl raised his hand in what might have been a wave, but felt more like a promise. We drove through the night and most of the next day, only stopping for gas and bathroom breaks. Dad called Pete from a roadside diner and told him we'd had to cut the vacation short. Thanked him for the offer, but said the cabin wasn't a good fit for our family. It wasn't until we were home, safe in our own house, that Dad explained what he'd learned during his phone calls that day. Earl Hutchins had worked at 4 different campgrounds over the past 15 years. At each location, children had disappeared. Not many. Never enough to establish a clear pattern, but enough to raise questions among local law enforcement. The disappearances were always chalked up to kids wandering off and getting lost in the woods, or running away from family problems, or drowning in lakes and rivers. But the timing was too convenient. Every disappearance had happened during Earl's tenure at these locations, and he'd always moved on to a new job within months of each incident. Dad had also discovered that Pine Ridge Campground had been flagged by the FBI as a possible hub for human trafficking. The remote location, the transient population of campers, the lack of close law enforcement, it was perfect for moving people without being noticed. "We got out just in time," Dad told Mom that night after Emma and I had gone to bed, but I was awake and listening from the top of the stairs. I think Earl was planning something for our last few days there. The way he looked at the kids, the questions he asked about our family, our financial situation. Mom started crying then, big silent sobs that shook her whole body. Dad held her while she cried, and I crept back to my room before they saw me. 2 weeks later, we saw Earl's picture on the evening news. Pine Ridge Campground had been raided by federal agents. They'd found a network of underground rooms beneath Earl's maintenance shed, equipped with chains and cameras and other things the news wouldn't describe in detail. They'd also found evidence linking Earl to the disappearances of 6 children over the past 3 years, including Sarah Henderson. Sarah's family had been found in their burned-out RV 30 miles from Pine Ridge, 3 days after they'd left the campground. The fire had been set to cover evidence, but investigators determined they'd been killed before the RV was torched. Sarah was never found. Earl and his associates had been using Pine Ridge as a way station for a trafficking ring that stretched across the northeastern United States. They would identify vulnerable families, people dealing with financial stress, social isolation, family problems, and gradually isolate them from other campers. Then they would take the children and eliminate the parents, making it look like accidents or family murder-suicides. We had been perfect targets. A struggling family with 2 young children, desperate enough to accept a free vacation from a distant acquaintance, isolated from our normal support system. If Dad hadn't made those phone calls, if he hadn't trusted his instincts, Earl was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. His associates received similar sentences. The FBI estimated that their ring had been responsible for at least 23 child disappearances across 6 states. But the damage was done. I stopped being able to sleep through the night. Every shadow looked threatening, every adult stranger seemed potentially dangerous. Emma developed night terrors and would wake up screaming about the camping man. Mom quit her job at the diner because she couldn't stand being around people, and Dad started drinking heavily. Not enough to become abusive, but enough that I could smell it on his breath most evenings. We never went camping again. We never took family vacations again. The experience had shattered something fundamental in all of us. The basic trust that the world was a safe place, that adults in authority could be trusted, that bad things mostly happened to other people. 23 years later, I still can't sleep in unfamiliar places without checking all the locks twice and pushing furniture in front of the door. I still feel a surge of panic when I see campgrounds or hear the jangle of keys on someone's belt. Emma moved across the country as soon as she turned 18, and we rarely talk. I think being around me reminds her too much of what we survived. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about Sarah Henderson. I think about how she tried to warn me, how she'd figured out what was happening but couldn't make the adults listen. I think about how she was probably awake and terrified in those final moments, knowing exactly what was about to happen to her family. And I think about all the other families who weren't as lucky as we were, who didn't have a father paranoid enough to make phone calls, who didn't leave in time, who trusted the friendly campground keeper right up until the end. The FBI told us that Earl kept detailed records of all his projects, including families who got away. Our names were in his files, along with notes about our vulnerabilities, our daily routines, our planned departure date. There were also detailed plans for how he intended to separate Emma and me from our parents on our last night at the campground. Those files are sealed now, part of an ongoing investigation into trafficking networks across the country. But sometimes I wonder if there are others like Earl still out there, still running remote campgrounds and state parks, still identifying vulnerable families and waiting for the right moment to strike. I have 2 children of my own now, and we live in a suburb with good schools and neighbors who know each other's names. My kids take swimming lessons at the community center and play Little League baseball and go to sleepovers with friends I've known for years. But I've never taken them camping, and I never will, because I know that monsters are real, and they don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like friendly old men with keys on their belts who know everything about the woods and want to teach your children about nature. Sometimes they look like people who are just trying to help. I was 9 years old the summer Mom started working nights at the bottling plant in Riverside, California. Dad had left 6 months earlier, just packed his things one Tuesday morning while I was at school, and Mom was at her day job at the bank. No note, no explanation, just gone along with half our savings and Mom's sense of security. The bank job barely covered rent on our tiny apartment in the East Side, and even with food stamps we were always behind on something: electricity, phone, car insurance. Mom would sit at our kitchen table surrounded by bills, calculator clicking frantically as she tried to make numbers work that would never add up right. That's when Mrs. Rodriguez from downstairs told Mom about the bottling plant. They paid almost double what the bank did, but it was graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 5 nights a week. Mom hated the idea of leaving me alone all night, but we were 2 months behind on rent and facing eviction. "It's just temporary, mija," she kept telling me and herself. "Just until I can find something better during the day." We both knew that was probably a lie, but it made the decision easier to bear. The apartment complex where we lived was a sprawling maze of faded yellow buildings built in the 1960s, inhabited mostly by single mothers, elderly retirees, and immigrant families scraping by on minimum wage jobs. It wasn't the worst neighborhood in Riverside, but it wasn't safe either. Police sirens were as common as ice cream trucks, and everyone had bars on their windows. My babysitter was supposed to be Mrs. Chen from apartment 2B. She was a widow in her 70s who watched 3 other kids in the building for working mothers. Sweet old lady who made the best dumplings I'd ever tasted and always smelled like jasmine tea and mentholated cream. The problem was that Mrs. Chen had her own health issues. Diabetes, high blood pressure, and what we'd later learn was early-stage dementia. Some nights, she'd forget she was supposed to watch me. Other nights, she'd fall asleep in front of her television and not hear me knocking. More than once, I'd find her confused and disoriented, unable to remember who I was or why I was at her door at midnight. Mom would call from her breaks at the plant, and I'd lie and tell her everything was fine, that Mrs. Chen and I had watched a movie and I was getting ready for bed. I didn't want Mom to worry, and I sure as hell didn't want her to quit the only job that might keep us from living in our car. So most nights, I was alone. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor, Unit 3C, with thin walls that let you hear every argument, every crying baby, every late-night visitor in the neighboring units. The building was old and full of sounds, pipes groaning, floorboards creaking, the intermittent buzz of fluorescent lights in the hallway that were always burning out. During the day, those sounds were just background noise. At night, when you're 9 years old and alone, every sound becomes a potential threat. The first few weeks weren't too bad. I'd do my homework, watch TV until I got sleepy, then go to bed around 10:30, about half an hour before Mom left for work. I was a good kid, never caused trouble, always locked the door behind Mom, never opened it for strangers, but being alone that much started to get to me. I'd lie in bed listening to footsteps in the hallway outside our door, wondering if they would stop, if someone would try the handle. I'd hear voices through the walls and try to determine if they sounded angry or threatening. Every car door slam in the parking lot made me think someone was coming for us. The building had a night security guard named Frank, who was supposed to walk the grounds and check the hallways. But Frank was a 60-year-old alcoholic who spent most of his shift sleeping in his car. The one time I actually needed him, when I heard someone trying apartment door handles on our floor. I couldn't find him anywhere. It was a Tuesday night in late August when everything changed. I'd fallen asleep on the couch watching reruns of old sitcoms and woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of keys jingling in our hallway. At first I thought it might be Mom coming home early, but it was way too soon for that. And besides, Mom always called out, "Mija, I'm home," when she came through the door. These footsteps were different, slower, more deliberate. And the key sounds were wrong too. Instead of the quick, efficient movement of someone unlocking their own door, this sounded like someone trying multiple keys, testing locks. I turned off the TV and crept to our door, standing on my tiptoes to look through the peephole. The hallway was dimly lit by those buzzing fluorescent lights, casting everything in harsh shadows, but I could see a man at the door of apartment 3A directly across from ours. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had a large ring of keys that he was methodically trying in Mrs. Patterson's lock. Mrs. Patterson was an 80-year-old woman who lived alone with her cat and was definitely asleep at this hour. My heart started hammering as I watched this stranger systematically work through his keys, testing each one with practiced patience. This wasn't someone locked out of his own apartment. This was someone breaking in. I should have called 911 immediately. That's what any adult would tell you to do. But I was 9 years old, terrified and convinced that making noise would draw his attention to our door. Instead, I stood frozen at the peephole, watching him work. After about 10 minutes, one of the keys worked. Mrs. Patterson's door swung open silently, and the man disappeared inside her apartment. I waited for screaming, for sounds of a struggle, for something that would tell me what was happening. But there was only silence, which was somehow worse than any sound would have been. 10 minutes passed. 20. Then I heard Mrs. Patterson's door close softly, and footsteps moving down the hallway toward the stairs. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in our living room chair positioned so I could see both the front door and the window that faced the courtyard. Every sound made me jump. Every car headlight that swept across our wall made me think someone was coming back. When Mom got home at 7:30 a.m., I was still sitting in that chair, fully dressed, exhausted, but unable to sleep. "Mija, why are you awake?" she asked, setting down her purse and looking at me with concern. "Did you have a bad dream?" I started to tell her what I'd seen, but then I stopped. Mom was already working herself to death trying to keep us afloat. She looked older than her 32 years, with dark circles under her eyes and worry lines that hadn't been there before Dad left. If I told her about the break-in, she'd quit her job to stay home with me, and we'd lose the apartment for sure. "Couldn't sleep," I said instead. "Too excited about school starting next week." Mom smiled and ruffled my hair. "Well, try to get some rest now. I'm going to take a quick shower and then we can have breakfast together before I need to sleep." After Mom went to bed, I knocked on Mrs. Patterson's door to check on her. No answer. I tried again in the afternoon, then again that evening. Still nothing. It wasn't until the next day that Mrs. Patterson's daughter came by to check on her mother and found the apartment empty. Not robbed exactly. The TV and jewelry were still there, but Mrs. Patterson was gone. Her purse, her medication, her cat, all gone without a trace. The police treated it as a missing person case, an elderly woman with early dementia who had wandered off and gotten lost. It happened all the time, they said. She'd probably turn up in a day or two, confused and dehydrated but otherwise okay. But I knew what I'd seen. Someone had used keys to enter her apartment in the middle of the night, and now she was gone. Mrs. Patterson never turned up. That's when I started paying closer attention to the patterns in our building. The night security guard who was never around when you needed him. The maintenance man who had keys to every apartment and seemed to know everyone's schedule. The way certain elderly residents would suddenly move away to live with family, without ever saying goodbye to neighbors they'd known for years. I started a notebook, writing down everything I observed during those long nights alone. Which apartments had lights on at unusual hours? Which ones went dark for days at a time? When the maintenance man made his rounds, and which doors he spent extra time at. The maintenance man's name was Ray Kowalski, and he'd worked at our complex for 8 years. He was maybe 45, average height, with thinning brown hair and the kind of forgettable face that made him invisible in a crowd. Ray knew which tenants were single mothers working night shifts, which elderly residents had no family visitors, which apartments had broken locks or faulty windows. He also had master keys to every unit in the complex. Over the next few weeks, I watched Ray's routine. He usually showed up around midnight, ostensibly to handle maintenance emergencies, but there were never any actual emergencies. Instead, he'd spend his time checking on specific apartments, always the ones inhabited by elderly women living alone. Mrs. Kim in 1A disappeared on a Thursday night in September. Her apartment was found unlocked the next morning, personal belongings scattered like she'd left in a hurry. The police assumed she'd had a medical emergency and wandered off in confusion. Mrs. Santos in 2D was gone by October. Same story. Door unlocked, signs of hasty departure, elderly woman with health issues who'd probably gotten disoriented and lost. I tried to tell Mom what I was seeing, but she was struggling just to stay awake during our brief moments together. The night shift was destroying her health, and the stress of single motherhood was wearing her down to nothing. When I mentioned my concerns about the missing neighbors, she'd pat my head and tell me not to worry about things that weren't my responsibility. "Adults disappear sometimes, Mija," she'd say. "They move away, go to live with family, enter nursing homes. It's not always sinister." But I knew it was sinister because I was watching it happen. The breakthrough came in late October, when I overheard Ray talking to someone on his cell phone outside our building. I was at our living room window watching for Mom's headlights when I saw him standing by the dumpster, having what sounded like an argument. "No, I can't move any faster," he was saying. "These things take time. You have to wait for the right opportunity when they won't be missed right away." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. The Patterson woman was perfect. No family visits. Neighbors barely knew her. But I can't just start grabbing people randomly. It has to look natural. Another pause. "Yeah, I've got 3 more identified. All elderly, all isolated, all on fixed incomes." Should be able to move them by Christmas if you can be patient. My blood turned to ice. Ray wasn't just stealing from these women or taking advantage of them financially. He was taking them, moving them. To where? For what purpose? I started recording our conversations with a cheap cassette recorder I'd gotten for my birthday. Night after night, I'd position myself by windows and doors, capturing fragments of Ray's phone calls and conversations with men who'd visit him during his rounds. The picture that emerged was horrifying. Ray was part of a network that targeted vulnerable elderly people in low-income housing developments. They'd identify residents who were isolated, had no family oversight, and lived on Social Security or disability payments. Then they'd remove them from their homes and transport them to unlicensed care facilities in remote locations, where their government benefits would be harvested while they were kept in substandard conditions. It was elder abuse on an industrial scale, and it was happening in apartment complexes and housing projects all across Southern California. The scariest part was how organized it was. Ray had accomplices who handled different aspects of the operation: people who forged documents, people who transported the victims, people who ran the illegal care facilities. They'd been doing this for years, and they were good at it. Good enough that they'd identified my mother and me as potential problems. I first realized we were being watched when I started noticing the same car parked outside our building at different times of day. A gray sedan with tinted windows that would sit in the lot for hours, engine off, someone inside watching the building entrances. Then I started seeing Ray paying more attention to our apartment. He'd find excuses to work on things near our door, always when Mom was at work and I was supposed to be with Mrs. Chen. He'd ask me casual questions about Mom's schedule, about whether we had family who visited, about whether we were planning to move soon. The questions felt friendly enough, but there was something predatory in Ray's pale blue eyes that made me uncomfortable. He was evaluating us, determining if we were obstacles or opportunities. Everything came to a head on Halloween night. Mom had to work, of course, and Mrs. Chen was having one of her bad days, confused and agitated, convinced that strangers were in her apartment. I'd given up trying to stay with her and resigned myself to another night alone. Around midnight, I heard Ray's keys in the hallway, but his routine was different that night. Instead of going to other apartments first, he came directly to our door. I heard him testing our locks, trying different keys just like he'd done with Mrs. Patterson's apartment. Unlike Mrs. Patterson, though, Mom had installed a security chain and a deadbolt that Ray's master keys couldn't defeat. After a few minutes of frustrated fumbling, he gave up and moved on to other apartments. But he'd be back, and next time he'd be prepared for our extra security measures. I called 911 from our landline, whispering into the receiver that there was a prowler in our building trying to break into apartments. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to check, but with Halloween night keeping police busy with more serious calls, it would be at least an hour before anyone could respond. An hour was too long. Ray would finish his rounds and disappear, and by the time police arrived, there would be no evidence of wrongdoing, just another maintenance man doing his job. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life and my mother's life, but also haunted my nightmares for years afterward. I left our apartment. Using the fire escape outside our bedroom window, I climbed down to the second floor and made my way to Ray's maintenance room in the building's basement. The door was unlocked. Ray was too confident, too comfortable in his routine to worry about security. Inside, I found his shrine to surveillance. Photos of elderly tenants pinned to corkboards with notes about their habits, their vulnerability levels, their estimated value as victims. Copies of master keys for multiple apartment complexes, schedules for pickups and deliveries that made my stomach turn, and boxes of personal belongings, jewelry, medication bottles, family photos, small valuable items that had belonged to the women who'd disappeared. I took as many photos as I could with a disposable camera I'd brought. Then I did something that still makes me feel sick to remember. I hid in Ray's maintenance room and waited for him to return. When Ray came back around 3 a.m., I was crouched behind a shelf of cleaning supplies, barely breathing, camera ready to document whatever he did next. What he did was make phone calls to coordinate the removal of Mrs. Jefferson from apartment 1C. She was scheduled to be moved to assisted living the following night, which I now understood meant she was going to disappear just like the others. Ray spent 20 minutes on the phone working out logistics. Who would create the distraction? Who would handle transport? Where Mrs. Jefferson would be taken? He talked about her like she was inventory, a commodity to be processed and monetized. When he finally left the maintenance room, I waited another hour before climbing back up the fire escape to our apartment. I had everything I needed to expose Ray's operation, but I also knew that reporting it would put Mom and me in immediate danger. Ray's network was too big, too well organized to go down quietly. If they suspected I'd gathered evidence against them, they'd eliminate the threat before police could act. Instead of calling 911, I did something more dangerous but probably more effective. I called the local television news station and told them I had evidence of a major elder abuse scandal. When the producer didn't take me seriously because I was a 9-year-old kid, I mailed them copies of my photos along with my detailed notes about the missing residents. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. By that afternoon, police had arrested Ray and raided his maintenance room. The investigation expanded rapidly as authorities realized the scope of the operation, eventually leading to arrests in 3 states and the rescue of over 40 elderly victims who'd been held in unlicensed facilities. Mrs. Patterson was found in a converted warehouse in Barstow, along with 11 other women who'd been reported missing from various housing complexes over the past 2 years. She was malnourished and confused, but alive. Ray received a life sentence. His accomplices got various terms ranging from 15 to 25 years. The unlicensed care facilities were shut down, and new oversight regulations were implemented for low-income housing maintenance staff. Mom quit her night job and found work as a bank teller at a credit union that offered better hours and benefits. We moved to a different apartment complex, one with better security and an active tenant association that looked out for vulnerable residents. But the damage was done to both of us. Mom developed severe anxiety and depression that required years of therapy and medication. She blamed herself for leaving me alone, for not seeing the danger that was right under our noses, for being too desperate and too tired to protect me properly. I developed what my therapist called hypervigilance, an inability to relax, constant scanning for threats, chronic insomnia that persisted well into my teenage years. I couldn't sleep in unfamiliar places, couldn't trust authority figures, couldn't stop analyzing people's behavior for signs of predatory intent. The scariest part wasn't the immediate danger we'd faced, but the realization of how vulnerable we'd been without ever knowing it. How many other Ray Kowalskis were out there, working in apartment complexes and housing projects, identifying isolated families and elderly residents who could disappear without anyone noticing? How many other 9-year-old kids were spending nights alone, watching predators operate in the shadows while exhausted parents worked jobs that barely kept them afloat? I'm 34 now, with a good job and a family of my own. My kids will never spend nights alone the way I did. We have security systems, neighborhood watch programs, extended family who check in regularly. All the safety nets that Mom and I didn't have during those desperate months after Dad left. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night listening to the normal sounds of our house settling, I remember the sound of Ray's keys testing our locks. I remember the casual way he talked about moving elderly women like they were furniture to be relocated. I remember how close we came to joining the list of people who simply disappeared one night and were never seen again. The investigation revealed that Ray's network had been operating for over a decade, targeting thousands of vulnerable people across the western United States. Most of the victims were never found, most of the perpetrators were never caught, and most of the apartment complexes where they operated still employ maintenance staff with master keys, still house isolated elderly residents and single mothers working night shifts, still provide the perfect hunting ground for predators who understand that society's most vulnerable people are also its most invisible. Every Halloween night, I think about Mrs. Patterson and the other women who survived that warehouse in Barstow. I think about the ones who didn't survive, whose disappearances were never solved, whose families never learned the truth about what happened to them. And I think about all the 9-year-old kids spending tonight alone in apartment complexes across America, listening to footsteps in the hallway and hoping they belong to someone safe. I was 10 years old when my family hired Stedman & Sons Moving Company to help us relocate from Detroit to Phoenix. Dad had lost his job at the Ford plant when they downsized the entire department, and after 8 months of unemployment, he'd finally found work at an aerospace company in Arizona. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was what we needed. Mom had been working double shifts at the hospital as a nursing assistant, but even with her income, we'd burned through our savings and were facing foreclosure on our house. The Arizona job came with a signing bonus that would cover moving expenses and give us a fresh start, but we had to be there by the first week of September. "It's going to be an adventure," Mom kept telling my younger brother Marcus and me. "A chance to see the desert, make new friends, start over somewhere with better weather." Marcus was 8 and bought into Mom's optimism completely. He was excited about potentially seeing roadrunners and coyotes, about living somewhere it never snowed. I was more skeptical. I liked our neighborhood in Detroit, liked my friends, liked knowing where everything was. Moving felt like losing everything familiar and safe. But we didn't have a choice. The moving estimate came back higher than expected. Professional moving companies wanted nearly $8,000 to pack and transport our belongings across the country, money we simply didn't have. Dad spent weeks calling different companies, trying to negotiate payment plans or find a better deal. That's when he found Stedman and Sons. Their estimate was less than half what the established companies quoted. When Dad asked how they could offer such competitive pricing, the owner, a man named Chuck Stedman, explained that they were a smaller, family-owned operation that kept overhead low by using their own trucks and employing relatives rather than union workers. "We've been in business for 15 years, Chuck told Dad over the phone. "Moved thousands of families across the Midwest and Southwest. We just don't have the fancy offices and advertising budgets that the big companies do." Chuck sounded friendly and professional. He asked detailed questions about our inventory, gave helpful advice about what to pack ourselves versus what to leave to the professionals, and even offered to delay payment until Dad received his signing bonus from the new job. "Family helping family," Chuck said. "That's how we do business." The paperwork looked legitimate. Stedman and Sons Moving Company was licensed and insured, with a proper Department of Transportation number, and what appeared to be good ratings from customer review websites. When Mom looked up their address online, it showed a warehouse facility in Toledo, Ohio, with photos of trucks and uniformed workers. Everything seemed above board. The crew that arrived at our house on moving day consisted of 4 men: Chuck Stedman himself, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a friendly demeanor, his alleged son Dale, who was maybe 25 with prison tattoos on his forearms, and 2 other men they introduced as Carlos and Big Jim. None of them looked related, and their truck, while large and apparently professional, had magnetic signs rather than painted company logos. But Dad was so relieved to have found affordable movers that he didn't ask questions. The crew worked efficiently, wrapping furniture and blankets, boxing up dishes and clothes, loading everything into their truck with practiced ease. They were friendly and professional, complimenting Mom on her cooking when she offered them lunch, playing catch with Marcus during their breaks, asking me about school and friends. Chuck took special interest in our family dynamics, asking lots of questions about our finances, our reasons for moving, whether we had relatives in Arizona who were expecting us. At the time, his questions seemed like normal conversation, a friendly business owner taking personal interest in his customers. Looking back, I realize he was gathering intelligence. The plan was for Stedman and Sons to drive our belongings to Phoenix while we flew out a few days later. Dad would start his new job immediately, and we'd live in a furnished apartment until our stuff arrived and we could find a permanent house. "Should take about 4 days for the truck to reach Phoenix," Chuck explained. "We'll call you with delivery scheduling once we're in town." We watched our entire life get loaded into their truck. Furniture, clothes, photo albums, Marcus's toy collection, my books and artwork, kitchen appliances, everything we owned except for the suitcases we'd take on the plane. The truck pulled away from our empty house on a Tuesday morning, and we flew to Phoenix that Friday. Chuck called Dad on Saturday to confirm they'd arrived safely and would deliver everything Monday morning. But Monday came and went with no delivery and no communication. When Dad called the number Chuck had given us, it went straight to voicemail. By Wednesday, Dad was panicking. He'd taken time off work for the delivery, and we desperately needed our belongings to set up our new apartment. More importantly, we'd put the Detroit house on the market and were staying in temporary housing that we couldn't afford long-term. Dad called the phone number listed on Stedman & Sons' website, but it was disconnected. He looked up their Toledo address and discovered it was actually a vacant lot. The Department of Transportation number they'd provided belonged to a different company entirely. "We've been scammed," Dad told Mom, his voice shaking with fury and disbelief. "Everything we own is gone." But it was worse than a simple scam. Over the next few days, as Dad filed police reports and tried to track down our belongings, a darker picture emerged. Stedman & Sons Moving Company didn't exist. It was a front operation for something much more sinister. The FBI agent assigned to our case explained that criminal networks had been using fake moving companies to identify and target vulnerable families for years. They'd offer low prices to families in financial distress, gather detailed information about their circumstances, then steal their belongings and sell the information to other criminals. But it's not just theft, Agent Martinez told us. These operations collect extensive data about families who are relocating, people who are isolated, financially stressed, don't have local support networks. That information gets sold to human trafficking rings, identity theft operations, home invasion crews. My stomach dropped as I understood what she was saying. Chuck and his crew hadn't just stolen our furniture. They'd stolen our privacy, our security, our safety. "The moving truck is probably already stripped and sold," Agent Martinez continued. "Your belongings are likely in a dozen different pawn shops by now. But the bigger concern is what they're doing with your personal information." Chuck's questions during the move suddenly made terrifying sense. He'd learned that we were completely isolated in a new state, that Dad was starting a job that would require frequent travel, that Mom would be home alone with 2 kids while looking for work. He'd seen our financial records, our identification documents, our family photos. He knew our routines, our vulnerabilities, our fears. Within a week of our belongings disappearing, strange things started happening. Someone tried to open credit cards in Dad's name. Our new apartment received deliveries we hadn't ordered, expensive electronics and jewelry that arrival with our address but different names. Men in unmarked vans would park outside our complex for hours watching our building. Most terrifying of all, Marcus and I started receiving attention from adults who knew things they shouldn't know. A man at the grocery store approached me while Mom was shopping, asked how I was adjusting to Phoenix, mentioned specific details about our move from Detroit that only Chuck's crew could have known. When I told Mom, she reported it to Agent Martinez, but by the time police responded, the man was gone. A woman at Marcus's new school claimed to be a family friend from Michigan, said she wanted to take him for ice cream to welcome him to Arizona. She knew our old address, mentioned our dog that we'd had to rehome before the move, talked about Dad's new job in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of our situation. Agent Martinez explained that this was how trafficking networks operated. They'd use stolen personal information to establish false familiarity with target families, then exploit that trust to gain access to children. "The moving company scam isn't about your furniture," she told us. "It's about gathering intelligence on vulnerable families, then selling that information to predators who specialize in different types of exploitation." The investigation revealed that Chuck Stedman was actually a man named Robert Hayes, a convicted felon with a history of fraud and assault charges. His crew consisted of other ex-convicts who worked for criminal networks across the Southwest. They'd been operating fake moving companies for 3 years, targeting families in financial distress who were relocating to new states. The scam worked because desperate families were willing to overlook warning signs in exchange for affordable services, and because people in transition were perfect targets for follow-up crimes. Over 50 families had been victimized by Hayes' operation. Most had their belongings stolen and sold, but the secondary crimes were even more devastating. 3 families had suffered home invasions by criminals who knew their layouts and schedules from the fake moving crews. 2 children had been approached by traffickers who knew their routines from stolen school records. One family, a single mother with a daughter Marcus's age, had disappeared entirely after hiring Hayes' company for a move from Kansas City to Denver. They were never found. Hayes was eventually arrested during a raid on a storage facility filled with stolen belongings, but by then, the damage to dozens of families was irreversible. He received a 20-year sentence for organized fraud, but his network of accomplices scattered across multiple states, and most were never caught. The stolen belongings were never recovered. Insurance companies wouldn't pay claims for theft by fraudulent movers, arguing that families should have verified credentials more thoroughly. We lost everything we owned and had no legal recourse. But the material losses were nothing compared to the psychological damage. Mom developed severe anxiety and depression, convinced that we were being watched constantly, that every stranger who showed interest in Marcus or me was a potential threat. She quit looking for work and rarely left our apartment, spending hours researching the backgrounds of neighbors, teachers, and anyone else who came into contact with our family. Dad's new job required frequent travel, but he was terrified to leave us alone. He'd call multiple times per day to check on us, installed security cameras and alarm systems we couldn't afford, considered quitting his job to stay home and protect us. Marcus, who'd been excited about the move initially, became withdrawn and fearful. He stopped making friends at school, refused to participate in activities that required him to be away from Mom, developed nightmares about strangers taking him away from our family. I became hyper-vigilant about adult behavior, analyzing every interaction for signs of deception or predatory intent. Teachers, neighbors, store clerks. Everyone seemed potentially dangerous, potentially connected to the criminal network that had invaded our lives. The FBI told us that Hayes' network maintained files on all their victims, tracking families for months or even years after the initial moving scam. Any of us could be approached by criminals at any time, and we'd have no way of knowing whether they were connected to the original theft or just random opportunists who'd purchased our information. The best thing you can do is be aware, Agent Martinez told us. Trust your instincts, verify credentials, report suspicious behavior, but don't let fear control your lives. Easy advice to give, impossible advice to follow. We moved 3 more times in the next 2 years. Different apartments, different schools, different routines, trying to stay ahead of potential threats. Each move was expensive and disruptive, but Dad was convinced that staying in one place too long made us vulnerable to criminals who might still be tracking us. The constant relocating made it impossible for Marcus and me to form stable friendships or feel settled anywhere. We learned not to get attached to places or people, not to share personal information, not to trust adults who seemed overly interested in our family. By the time I was in high school, we'd moved 6 times since arriving in Phoenix. I'd attended 4 different schools, lived in apartments and rental houses across 3 different cities in Arizona. My childhood consisted of packing and unpacking boxes, learning new routines, starting over with strangers who might or might not be safe. The irony was that the constant moving, our strategy for staying safe, had made us exactly the kind of isolated, vulnerable family that criminals like Hayes targeted in the first place. I'm 28 now, married to a woman I met in college, living in a house we've owned for 3 years, the longest I've ever lived anywhere since childhood. We have a baby daughter, and I'm already terrified about how to protect her from the predators who use legitimate-seeming services to gain access to vulnerable families. I research every contractor, every service provider, every business that comes to our house. I verify licenses, check references, look up addresses and phone numbers. I probably seem paranoid to people who haven't experienced what we went through, but I know how easily criminals can impersonate legitimate businesses. The moving industry still operates largely unregulated, with minimal oversight of who can rent a truck and start a company. Desperate families still fall victim to fake movers every year, and the secondary crimes, the identity theft, the stalking, the trafficking, rarely make news because they're difficult to connect to the original scam. Agent Martinez retired from the FBI 5 years ago, but she still sends me updates when criminals connected to Hayes' network are arrested. Most of his accomplices were never caught. The storage facilities where they kept stolen belongings were emptied and abandoned. The families whose information was sold to trafficking rings never learned the full extent of how their privacy was violated. Sometimes I wonder what happened to that single mother and her daughter who disappeared after hiring Hayes' crew. Whether they were killed, trafficked, or just driven so deep underground by fear that they'll never surface again. I wonder how many families are living like we lived, constantly moving, constantly afraid. constantly looking over their shoulders for threats that might or might not still exist. And I wonder how many children are growing up the way Marcus and I grew up, unable to trust, unable to settle, unable to believe that any place or person is truly safe. The worst part isn't the material losses or even the ongoing fear. It's the knowledge that we were targeted specifically because we were vulnerable, because criminals recognized that a financially desperate family in transition would be easy to exploit and difficult to help. We weren't random victims of crime. We were carefully selected prey, chosen by predators who understood exactly how desperation makes people ignore warning signs and take dangerous risks. That's a lesson that stays with you forever. The understanding that your vulnerability is visible to people who want to harm you, and that the very circumstances that make you need help also make you a target for those who would exploit that need. Every time I see a moving truck in our neighborhood now, I think about Hayes and his crew loading our entire life into their vehicle while chatting pleasantly about the weather. I think about how normal and professional they seemed, how grateful we were for their affordable services, how completely we trusted them with everything we owned. And I think about all the families who are hiring movers today, desperate for affordable services, hoping they've found legitimate help but possibly inviting predators into their homes and lives. Some monsters don't hide in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. They hide behind legitimate-seeming businesses, friendly customer service, and prices too good to be true. They're the ones who show up at your door when you're most desperate, offering exactly what you need at exactly the price you can afford. And by the time you realize what they really are, they already have everything. I was 11 years old when I discovered that my uncle's photography studio wasn't what it appeared to be. Uncle Pete had always been Mom's favorite brother, the successful one, the one who'd made something of himself while the rest of our family struggled paycheck to paycheck in rural Ohio. Dad worked construction when there was work to be found, which wasn't often after the housing market crashed in 2008. Mom cleaned houses for wealthy families in the next town over, coming home exhausted and resentful every night. We lived in a single-wide trailer on my grandmother's property, sharing space with too many people, and never enough privacy. Uncle Pete, by contrast, owned his own business in Columbus. Pete's portrait studio specialized in family photos, senior pictures, children's modeling portfolios, the kind of clean, legitimate work that impressed our relatives and made Mom beam with pride whenever his name came up at family gatherings. Peter's always had an eye for beauty, Mom would say. Even as a kid, he was taking pictures of everything, developing film in Grandma's basement. Now look at him. His own studio, clients from all over central Ohio. Pete drove a new Lexus and wore expensive clothes. He'd show up to family barbecues with gifts for all the kids. Latest video games, brand-name shoes, electronics our parents could never afford. He was generous with money, always offering to help when Dad was between jobs or when Mom needed dental work. Most importantly to me, Pete paid attention to kids in a way that made us feel special. He'd ask about school, remember details about our friends and interests, treat us like our opinions mattered. In a family where children were often seen as burdens or inconveniences, Pete made us feel valued. That's why when Pete offered to give me modeling lessons during summer break, Mom was thrilled. "This could be a real opportunity, honey," she told me. "Pete thinks you have potential. Maybe you could make some money, help the family out, even get discovered by an agency in Columbus." I was 11, awkward and self-conscious about my changing body, desperate for something to make me feel special. The idea of being a model, of being pretty enough, interesting enough, worth photographing, was intoxicating. Pete's studio was located in a converted warehouse in an industrial part of Columbus, surrounded by auto repair shops and storage facilities. The building looked professional from the outside, with clean signage and a well-maintained parking lot. Inside, it was divided into different sections: a reception area with comfortable furniture and magazines, several photography studios with professional lighting equipment, a dark room for developing film, and Pete's private office. My first few sessions were exactly what I'd expected. Pete taught me about posing, lighting, how to feel comfortable in front of a camera. He was patient and encouraging, explaining how modeling was about confidence and storytelling, Not just physical appearance. The camera sees everything, he'd tell me. It picks up on insecurity, fear, dishonesty. The best models learn to be completely relaxed and natural, to trust the photographer completely. The photos from those early sessions were beautiful, tasteful portraits that made me look older and more sophisticated than I felt. Pete gave me prints to take home, and Mom displayed them prominently on our refrigerator, showing them to anyone who'd pay attention. "Look at my daughter, the model," she'd say proudly. "Pete says she's got real potential." For the first time in my life, I felt like I was good at something, like I had value beyond just being another mouth to feed in our struggling household. The sessions gradually became more frequent and more elaborate. Pete would have me come in after school, sometimes on weekends. He'd experiment with different outfits, different poses, different themes for the shoots. "Modeling is about versatility," he'd explain. "The girls who make it in this business can adapt to any style, any concept. You need to be comfortable with change, willing to try new things." The outfits started getting more mature. Cocktail dresses instead of casual clothes, more makeup, hairstyles that made me look years older. Pete would have me practice walking in high heels, posing in ways that emphasized my developing figure. When I felt uncomfortable, Pete would reassure me that this was normal in professional modeling. "The fashion industry has different standards than regular life," he'd say. "What might seem inappropriate to your parents is completely normal in this business. That's why most models start young. They learn these skills before they develop the hang-ups that adults have about their bodies." Pete introduced the concept of artistic photography gradually, explaining that the most successful models were willing to do more creative avant-garde work that pushed boundaries. "Look at any fashion magazine," he'd tell me, showing me photographs from Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. "The girls who become famous are the ones willing to take risks, to create art that makes people think and feel." The photos became increasingly suggestive, though Pete was careful never to cross obvious lines. He'd have me pose in ways that were provocative but technically innocent, wearing outfits that were revealing but not explicitly inappropriate for a child. Throughout this progression, Pete maintained the fiction that this was professional modeling preparation. He'd talk about agencies that specialized in artistic work, about how building a diverse portfolio was essential for serious models, about how the fashion industry was more open-minded than mainstream society. "This stays between us for now," he'd say. "Your parents wouldn't understand the artistic aspects of what we're doing. They'd worry unnecessarily and might make you stop, which would hurt your chances of making it in this business." The secrecy felt natural and professional. Models had to maintain their image, had to be selective about what they shared with people who weren't part of the industry. Pete was protecting my career by keeping our more advanced work private. It wasn't until I was 12, almost a year into my modeling career, that I discovered what was really happening in Pete's studio. I'd arrived early for a Saturday session and used my key to enter through the back door like Pete had taught me. As I walked toward the main studio, I heard voices coming from one of the other photography rooms. Pete's voice, and a man's voice I didn't recognize. Curiosity made me creep closer to listen. Through the slightly open door, I could see Pete showing photographs to another man, discussing them in terms I'd never heard him use before. "This one's particularly popular," Pete was saying, holding up what looked like one of my photos. "Clients pay premium prices for this type of content. Natural, innocent, but sophisticated enough to appeal to our target demographic." The other man was examining the photos with an intensity that made my stomach feel strange. "How old did you say she was?" "Just turned 12. Been working with her for about a year now. Very compliant, trusting family situation. Mother's completely supportive of her modeling career. And the family doesn't suspect anything?" Pete laughed. "They think I'm doing them a favor helping their daughter become a professional model. The mother brags about it to anyone who'll listen. As long as I keep telling them she has potential and giving them a few innocent photos to display, they're thrilled." My blood turned to ice as I understood what I was hearing. Pete wasn't a legitimate photographer. The modeling lessons weren't preparation for a career in fashion. The photos he'd been taking of me, photos I'd been proud of, photos that made me feel special and mature, were being sold to men who wanted to look at children. The other man was flipping through more photographs. some of which I recognized as images of me, others showing girls I'd never seen before, all young, all posed in ways that now seemed sinister rather than artistic. "What about progression to more explicit content?" the man asked. "That's the next phase," Pete replied. "Once they're completely comfortable with the camera and fully trust the process, you can push boundaries more aggressively. The key is making them feel like willing participants, like they're making professional decisions rather than being victimized." I backed away from the door quietly, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid they'd hear it. Everything I'd believed about myself, about my potential, about Pete's interest in helping me had been a lie. Worse than a lie, it had been a calculated manipulation designed to exploit my insecurities and my family's desperation for something positive in our lives. I spent the rest of that weekend in a state of shock, trying to process what I'd learned while pretending everything was normal around my family. Mom was planning to attend my next session to see my progress, something that had never happened before but now seemed ominous rather than exciting. Monday morning, instead of going to school, I went to the police station in our town and tried to explain what I'd discovered. The desk sergeant was patient but skeptical. I was 12 years old making serious accusations against an adult relative, with no physical evidence beyond photographs that might look innocent to people who didn't understand the context. "Are you sure you understood what you heard?" the officer asked. "Sometimes adult conversations can be confusing to kids. Maybe your uncle was talking about something else." But I knew what I'd heard, and more importantly, I knew what I'd felt in that moment. The realization that every compliment Pete had given me, every encouragement about my potential, every moment of feeling special and valued, had been part of a predatory plan. The police took my statement and said they'd look into it, but I could tell they weren't taking me seriously. A 12-year-old girl with an active imagination, probably jealous of an uncle's success, possibly coached by adults with their own agenda. When Pete called that afternoon to confirm our session for later in the week, I told Mom I didn't want to do modeling anymore, that I'd lost interest and wanted to focus on school instead. Mom was devastated. "Honey, you can't just give up when you're so close to making it. Pete says you have real talent. This could change our whole family situation." I couldn't explain what I'd learned without revealing that I'd been sneaking around and eavesdropping, and I wasn't sure Mom would believe me anyway. Pete was her brother, her success story, the one person in our family who'd made something of himself. Accepting that he was a predator would mean accepting that she'd put her daughter in danger while feeling proud about it. Instead, I developed what adults interpreted as typical preteen moodiness and rebellion. I became difficult about the modeling sessions, showing up late, refusing to wear certain outfits, being uncooperative during shoots. Pete initially tried patience and encouragement, but as my resistance continued, his demeanor changed. The warm, supportive uncle began to show flashes of anger and manipulation. "I've invested a lot of time and money in your career," he'd tell me. "The least you could do is show some appreciation and professionalism." When I continued to resist, Pete shifted tactics and began undermining my self-esteem. The same insecurities he'd initially built up, he now attacked. "Maybe I was wrong about your potential," he'd say. "Maybe you're not mature enough for this business after all." The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and cruel. Pete understood exactly how to make me feel guilty, ungrateful, and worthless, while maintaining his role as the disappointed but patient mentor. Finally, after several more sessions where I was increasingly uncooperative, Pete announced that he was ending our professional relationship. "I think it's best if we take a break from the modeling work," he told Mom. "Maybe when she's older and more focused, we can revisit it." Mom was crushed, apologizing profusely for my behavior and begging Pete to give me another chance. But Pete was firm. I demonstrated that I wasn't serious about modeling and he couldn't continue investing in someone who didn't appreciate the opportunity. From Pete's perspective, I'd become a liability rather than an asset. A cooperative child who trusted him completely was valuable. A suspicious, uncooperative child was dangerous. It wasn't until 3 years later that the full scope of Pete's operation was exposed. A 15-year-old girl named Jennifer Morrison went to police with explicit photographs that Pete had taken of her, along with evidence that he'd been selling these images to a network of buyers across the United States. Jennifer's parents had believed, just like mine, that their daughter was receiving professional modeling training from a successful photographer. The investigation that followed revealed that Pete had been operating his studio as a front for child exploitation for over 8 years. He'd photographed dozens of children from families across central Ohio, gradually escalating the explicit nature of the images, while convincing parents that their children were receiving valuable professional training. Pete's client list included doctors, lawyers, teachers, coaches, respectable members of the community who were paying premium prices for access to sexual images of children. The network extended across multiple states and included sophisticated systems for distributing and selling the photos while avoiding detection. When police raided Pete's studio, they found thousands of photographs of children, detailed files on families he was targeting or had already exploited, and correspondence with buyers that made clear the sexual nature of his business. They also found photographs of me, not just the innocent portraits Mom had displayed on our refrigerator, but dozens of images from our sessions that Pete had never shared with our family. Photos that had been carefully composed to appeal to buyers while maintaining plausible deniability about their purpose. The detective who interviewed me was gentle but thorough, asking detailed questions about my experiences with Pete, my understanding of what had been happening, my reasons for becoming uncooperative with the sessions. "You probably saved yourself from much worse," she told me. Based on Pete's pattern with other victims, children who continued cooperating eventually were pressured into increasingly explicit photography. Your resistance likely prevented serious escalation. Pete received a 25-year sentence. Several members of his buyer network were also arrested and convicted. The studio was shut down, and Pete's assets were seized to compensate victims. But the damage to the families involved was irreversible. Jennifer Morrison's family fell apart under the weight of guilt and recrimination. Her parents divorced, blaming each other for not protecting their daughter. Jennifer herself required years of therapy and struggled with depression and trust issues throughout high school and college. Other families experienced similar destruction. Marriages ended, children developed behavioral problems, parents battled substance abuse and mental health crises as they tried to cope with the realization that they'd unknowingly facilitated their children's exploitation. My own family's response was complicated by the fact that I'd escaped serious harm through my own instincts and resistance. Mom felt guilty about pushing me to continue the sessions, but also defensive about her original decision to trust Pete. "How was I supposed to know?" she'd ask repeatedly. "He was my brother. He seemed to genuinely care about you. Everything looked professional and legitimate." Dad was angry. At Pete, at Mom for not seeing the warning signs, at himself for not being more involved in my activities, at the system that had allowed a predator to operate for years without detection. But mostly, they were confused about how to help me process what had happened. I hadn't been physically abused in any obvious way. The photographs, while exploitative, weren't explicitly sexual. My trauma was psychological and complex: the violation of trust, the manipulation of my self-worth, the knowledge that my image had been sold to strangers for sexual purposes. Traditional therapy felt inadequate for addressing the unique aspects of what I'd experienced. How do you help a teenager understand that she'd been groomed and exploited when the exploitation was subtle and the grooming had been disguised as opportunity and empowerment? The worst part was the way it changed how I saw myself and my relationships with adults. Every compliment felt potentially manipulative. Every adult who took special interest in my achievements or abilities seemed potentially dangerous. Teachers, coaches, family friends, anyone who praised my work or encouraged my development became suspect in my mind. I developed a cynical, defensive approach to relationships that made it difficult to accept genuine help or mentorship throughout my teenage years. I also struggled with guilt about the other victims, particularly the children who'd continued in Pete's program after I'd left. If I'd spoken up sooner, if I'd been more insistent with police, if I'd found a way to expose Pete earlier, how many other kids might have been spared? The detective assured me that my resistance had likely prompted Pete to be more cautious with other victims, possibly preventing worse exploitation. But the knowledge that other children had suffered while I'd remained silent was difficult to bear. I'm 26 now, working as a social worker specializing in child protection services. My experience with Pete shaped my career choice. I understand how predators operate, how they identify and exploit vulnerable families, how they use legitimate-seeming activities to gain access to children. I know how to recognize the warning signs that adults miss, how to ask children the right questions to uncover abuse, how to help families understand that predators often don't look like monsters. They look like successful, generous, caring members of the community. But I also understand the complexity of recovery from this type of exploitation. The children Pete photographed didn't just lose their innocence, they lost their ability to trust their own judgment, to believe that adults who show interest in them have genuine, non-exploitative motives. Many of Pete's victims still struggle with relationships, careers, self-esteem issues that stem from having their trust systematically manipulated during crucial developmental years. The psychological damage from this type of abuse often persists long after the physical threat has ended. The most insidious part of Pete's operation wasn't the photography itself, but the way he convinced children and families that exploitation was opportunity, that violation was mentorship, that predatory behavior was professional development. He didn't just take photographs. He stole our ability to recognize danger, to trust our instincts, to believe that we deserved protection rather than exploitation. 24 years later, I still find myself analyzing the motivations of adults who take interest in my work or offer to help with my career. I still struggle to accept praise without wondering what the person giving it hopes to gain from me. The trauma isn't just about what Pete did, it's about what he took away. The innocence, yes, but more importantly, the basic human capacity to form trusting relationships with mentors and authority figures. That's the hidden cost of child exploitation that most people don't understand. It's not just about the immediate harm, but about the lifelong inability to believe that someone might want to help you without wanting to hurt you. Sometimes I wonder how many Petes are out there right now, operating legitimate-seeming businesses that give them access to vulnerable children and desperate families. Photography studios, modeling agencies, talent scouts, youth mentors, all potentially perfect covers for predators who understand that the best way to exploit children is to convince their families that exploitation is actually opportunity. The scariest part isn't that monsters exist. It's that they're so good at convincing us they're not monsters at all.